Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a recent reads. Usually I do these in my TBRs for the next month. I kind of discuss what I've read since the last TBR, but due to some vacation time I was taking, I had to do my TBR a little bit early, so I wanted to wait until the end of the month before I got into my recent read ranking. Overall, I had a pretty decent reading month. There are a couple of these, I guess the majority were kind of good but not great books, so most of them are around 4 stars, but not really many 5 stars this month. I think the only 5 stars I have, I actually technically finished the very end of April. Excuse me, very end of March, and just like maybe within the first day or two of April. But the majority are, like I said, about 4 stars. So let's just get into this because I have 8 books to talk about. The first one I have here is Lady Anna by Anthony Trollope. This is a classic from the 19th century. In it, we followed the unfortunate backstory behind this young woman, Lady Anna. Although that is the question, is she Lady Anna? Because there are some questions regarding the legitimacy of her parents' marriage, and so either she is a lady and inherits a lot of money, or she's not. She's an illegitimate child and she will be cast aside by society. And we end up following her through particularly how this impacts her marital opportunities and options, as well as her relationships with her mother and other people around her. I ended up really enjoying it, although I did only give it, I think maybe 3.25 stars. I can't remember exactly. Suffice it to say, it was around kind of an average book. There was a lot that was very thought-provoking in this, but a lot of it is really focused on the legal matters behind the court cases, and so it ends up feeling kind of repetitive and a little bit dull at some points because of that over-focus on the legal side of things. However, the situation with her marital prospects is very interesting to consider. I really love Trollope primarily because he's really good at making it so there's not really a bad guy. Everybody's very complex. They have a lot to them. They're not all good or all bad. They're all just living life and doing the best they can. I think the ones who maybe come the closest to being super good, pretty much all good, are a lot of the women in his stories. And in this case, Lady Anna kind of is on that line, although she does have flaws of her own for sure. But anyway, yes, I really love his characterization and how he explores relationships between these characters. I really found Lady Anna's mother to be very interesting. In fact, I would say she was my favorite part of this book. Although I did also like learning about both of the men in her life, her marital prospects, because I feel like they were both very different men in social standing and wealth, yes, but also in personalities, and it was just very interesting to kind of compare and contrast them and see how their personalities would have impacted Anna if she became their wife. So definitely not my favorite Trollope by a long shot, but one I'm glad I read. I would be willing to revisit it in the future. I did find it very interesting. It just had a lot of dullness to it and repetition to it that made it kind of difficult to really love. Next, I have The Mitford Affair by Marie Benedict. I believe I gave this just a solid 4 stars. In fact, I think the next 2 after this I also gave a solid 4 stars to. This one follows the story of the Mitford sisters, so specifically we're in the heads of Nancy Mitford, who was a writer, Unity Mitford, who actually was good friends with Hitler, and Diana Mitford, who also was involved in a lot of the fascist movement, particularly in the UK. Very, very interesting family from the time. They are a real set of sisters. They also have, if I remember correctly, 3 other sisters that are definitely mentioned in this, but we're following those 3 specific perspectives. And it was really well done as far as being able to get to know these sisters. I really didn't know that much about them beforehand, so it made me intrigued. It also had some just interesting thoughts about history and what we know and what we can only guess at. And I really appreciated that, particularly in the end, how that was addressed. This only got a 4 stars from me because there wasn't really any X factor that really drew me specifically to this book, but I'm very glad I read it. Like, I don't regret it at all, and it's one I even be willing to revisit once I learn more about the Mitford sisters. But yeah, it just didn't have anything that really gripped me. It was just a solid read, one I'm glad I read, that was very thought-provoking, and just, yeah, a really good book. Next, I have a book that I actually did did have higher, but over time I have kind of just not thought about it as much as I thought I would, and that's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Like I said, I gave this about 4 stars. I think depending on the day I could raise it up a little bit, but it just didn't stick with me. This story, to keep it as simple as possible without giving any spoilers away, follows a young woman who, when she was a child, she attended a boarding school, a very special boarding school that had some very interesting things going on. That's all I'll say about it because I don't want to give away some of the plot twists and the truth behind a lot of the goings on in this book, but really at its heart, it's a story about life and humanity. The writing's beautiful. I definitely was very driven to read this. Every time I put it down, I really wanted to pick it back up. And like I said, it was very thought-provoking regarding those themes that I mentioned. I mentioned in my vlog that contained this that it kind of discussed sex a lot, and not in a way, partially in a way where it connected back to the themes, but then there were certain moments where it just ended up feeling like the author was mentioning having sex just to mention having sex, like for their own gratification, and it was just weird. So I didn't love that. There was also some slow aspects to the story, and like I said, it just hasn't stuck with me as much as I thought it would. I mean, I do remember a lot that happened in it, so it's not like I've forgotten. It's just not one that I've returned to in my mind very much. So I felt like I couldn't give this much higher than a 4. Like I said, some days I may even give it a 4.25 or 4.5. It wouldn't be a 5 stars, but I could see it rising a little bit up. It just, yeah, it's one that had a lot of great things to it, but also a lot that it wasn't necessarily like something I'd fall in love with. Up next, we have another solid 4-star read, and that is Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. I've had this book for so long, so I'm so glad I finally read it. This story starts off in this inn where the thing that you do there is tell stories. It's a storytelling inn. All the regulars know how to tell stories. They'll spend evenings drinking and storytelling with each other, and it's just kind of a magical feeling place in some ways because of that. It's right along the River Thames, and one night something very strange happens. A man who is clearly injured comes in holding a girl that seems dead. However, a miracle seems to happen a few hours later, and this girl seems to come back to life. However, she's mute, so there's a big question of who is she, basically, throughout this story. I say that, but really this story, it is focused and centered around that as far as a plot goes, but the underlying purpose of this book is to discuss stories and the barrier between fantasy and reality, the barrier between grief and healing, between childhood and adulthood, between a child and their parents. It's just a lot of basically transitions and opposing sides of something that would fall along the opposite riverbanks, basically, if you're thinking of it symbolically. So it's a really beautiful story. There was definitely a lot of moments in this where it felt really slow. I didn't really look forward to picking it up as much. Not that I didn't look forward to it, I did. It was just a lot harder for me to get myself to pick it up because there were a lot of slow parts to it. But ultimately, I really did love it. Diane Setterfield's writing is beautiful. It could be kind of flowery for some people, I'm sure, but I personally really love it. There's definitely a feeling of the Victorian style writing in her books that I just feel like is really hard to capture in a modern novel, so I really love that about her. I would say The 13th Tale I would put above this still, but this is a close second as far as my favorites by her, and yeah, I'm so glad I finally got around to it. Next, I have a nonfiction, and that is The Dark Queens by, can't remember, but here is the cover. This is a nonfiction following 2 medieval queens who were actually rivals of each other, Fredegund and, can I remember the other name? It starts with a B. Brunhild. Fredegund and Brunhild. These were queens who ruled in the early medieval times / kind of that transition period after the fall of Rome, but before we get solidly into what we would call the medieval times, or I guess you could say the very beginning of the medieval times, that very early stages. And it was really interesting. I did enjoy it a lot. I listened to it on audiobook. It was very easy to get into and understand. I will say, I feel like it would have helped me to read this physically, actually, instead of listening to it on audiobook, because I was getting really lost with all of the different names. I unfortunately did not have very much background information on this time period and these people. So it was very easy to get lost in this. I just felt like I needed something to help guide me along with that, which isn't necessarily the book's fault, but it did impact my experience with it, which is why I ended up giving it a 4.5 stars. So pretty high, because I do think the author did a really good job in exploring these two women and the times they were living in and everything going on, especially with having so little information about this time period and especially these women. But it did become kind of difficult to follow. There were just a lot of names, and I would have liked, maybe it did have one. I don't think I saw one. Some books will have, nonfiction books will have like a PDF that's connected with it that you can look through to look for information. I don't think I saw one associated with this, and if it had one, I think that would have helped. But like I said, I didn't really look that hard because I was listening to it mostly in the car, and then I'd always forget to check. So anyway, that was an issue. There was also just the sense of there is so much we don't know, and so I felt like I wish she would have pointed out which areas were a little bit more uncertain due to our lack of information, just because I'm like, if I'm wanting to learn about these women, I want to have an understanding of what we actually know versus what we're only guessing at. She did do that in some cases for sure. It wasn't like she was just making stuff up the whole time and acting like it was all fact or anything like that. I just wish there had been a little bit more discussion of what pieces of the story she was kind of basing on assumptions as opposed to solid facts. Like I said, she did do pretty well. She discussed references and stuff throughout the story, but I did have times where I was like, okay, is this something we really know happened, or is this just the author guessing at it? But it was a really easy book to read. Definitely recommend it. These women are really fascinating, and I would love, like I said, to get a physical copy so I can physically read it and hopefully get even more out of it. Next, I have a reread that kind of surprised me. It is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Like many other students of America, I did read this in high school, and I remember enjoying it, but it's been so long since I read it. Like, it's been probably at least a decade, maybe a little bit more. So I really didn't remember that much about it, and I just felt like, I need to try again and see how I feel about it now that I've read a lot more classics. I'm more familiar with the language of the 19th century. So I listened to this on audiobook on my trip, where I actually went to Salem, went to the House of the Seven Gables and his birthplace as well. I also went to the Old Manse, which is a home that he lived in Concord, Massachusetts for 3 years. So I thought it was a perfect time to revisit this. So that's what I did. And first of all, I already knew after reading The House of the Seven Gables a couple of years ago that Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing is beautiful. So reading this, that was just solidified for me. So going into this, I expected that, and I was not disappointed. His writing truly is absolutely gorgeous. There were a lot of portions where I don't think I really grasped the full meaning of what was being said, because I just, I was walking around and looking at stuff, so I was kind of distracted. But just the feel of his words in my ears was just wonderful. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where just the way someone puts together their sentences, whether that be writing or listening to them, it's just very comforting and cozy. And so listening to it on an audiobook or even reading it physically really brought a little bit of joy for me, even when I wasn't completely grasping exactly what was happening. That being said, I did understand the plot enough to know what was going on, and this is really a very psychological journey. I guess if you don't know, this story starts off with this young woman who has been in a jail, and she comes out holding a baby, and she has a red letter A sewed onto her dress, and this A stands for adulteress, and so she is condemned to wear this for the rest of her life to mark her. That is her punishment by the community, but she refuses to tell them who the father is. And so this whole story is about her struggles, but also about the father's struggle, the father of the child, and how he feels guilt for not standing up with them, but also he wants to hang on to this life that he has. And then of course some other people that are involved in this story and their psychology and how they're getting revenge and interacting with these two main characters. It's a story rich with symbolism and and like I said, beautiful language, and I just really, really enjoyed it. I'm so glad I revisited it. I actually would love to reread it again sometime soon physically and see if I can get even more out of it that way, as I'm sure I would. Then we have a couple of nonfiction. So first of all, I have How to Be a Victorian, A Dawn to Dusk Guide to Victorian Life by Ruth Goodman. This is exactly what it sounds like. It is a discussion of the daily lives of people in the Victorian period. So it starts in the morning with getting out of bed and ends with them going back to bed, and just talks about the various cultural aspects of those different things that we do as people. It was really interesting, very well written. There were definitely some points that I found kind of dry, but even those points I ended up, later on being like, oh, this was kind of interesting, and telling people about it. Definitely a great read for people who are history buffs and who like Victorian literature, because there's a lot in here that will help you understand, I think, certain scenes and things within Victorian literature a little bit better. This is one I'll definitely reference a lot throughout the rest of my life, probably the rest of my reading life, because I do love Victorian literature and the Victorian era, and I just feel like this gives a really good understanding of, and not just a certain part of the Victorian period, but the whole entire thing, and how certain cultural things changed and how certain cultural things stayed the same, how culture then impacts culture now. Like I said, just really well written, easy to understand, and one that I would highly recommend if you're interested in stuff like this. And my number one read from the past about a month of reading was Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley by Charlotte Gordon. This is a biography of Mary Shelley and her mother Mary Wollstonecraft, and it is beautifully done, so engaging to read. I listened to this one on an audiobook as well, and the audiobook narrator did a great job. These two women are just fascinating, their lives are fascinating, and the way it was told in this story really was done in a way that it brought it to life while also acknowledging some of our lack of information in certain areas, and a discussion of the psychology behind these women who are dealing with the people they're interacting with, the society they're living in, and it's just a really well done book, really well done nonfiction work. I know I'm not the first to sing its praises, and I'm sure I won't be the last here on BookTube, but if you have not heard about this, or if you've been unsure if you were going to pick it up, definitely do so, because it is amazing. It's one I have thought about a lot since reading it, and I would say over the past month it's been my favorite thing that I have read, which is kind of sad because I finished it like right at the beginning of this section of reading time in my life, so the rest I guess you could kind of say went downhill, but I mean, I did love The Scarlet Letter, which I ended with, so it all worked out. So that is it. That is my reading for the month of April. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, your thoughts on them, as I would love to know. I hope you are having a wonderful reading week, and I will see you next time. Bye!